Part 12. The Essence of Bondage. The essence of bondage and separation from life. All ties that bind must be removed in order to be free. This requires the rescission of signatures previously applied, the revocation of powers of attorney previously conveyed, and the termination of contracts previously engaged. In total, this constitutes the rescinding of the contractual agreements entered and maintained pursuant to the law of the contracts, all into which we have blindly strayed. We leave the realm of the dead and walk unto the land of the living, where we have standing, status, and capacity, where we are empowered as a king or queen, sovereign, and is solvent. The sea of commerce is a sea of death under which civilly dead entities are submerged. This is why a debt against our home is known as a mortgage, derived from the French, wherein the word mort means death or dead, and gage means pledge. So a mortgage is a pledge of death, and our home becomes a house of death, and will always revert to the winner, the state, in the casino game of public commerce, where instead of lawful money, we receive wages that are a bet against the inevitable, whether we live or are harvested with a heavy heart by the grim reaper, where the latter outcome is assured by time. Concurrent with the initiation of building the City of London after the Great Fire of London in September 1666 was the passage of the Sestakv Act. The essence of this act was that for roughly 400 to 500 years, men were going to war by land and exploration by sea. By men we mean a man on the land, one who is bound to his liege lord by an oath of fealty, the benefit of which is to be of the landed gentry, the nobility, the elite. All others are not men, they are human beings. By definition in law, a human being is an animal, a monster. More precisely, a human being as a monster has no inheritable blood and cannot be heir to land. Some will argue that this definition only applies to those born with deformities. But in the legal game of obfuscation, most things are enacted for one purpose and progressively morphed into another. So the masses are considered deformed precisely because they are not on the land and thus have no inheritable blood. Thus, when we think we are on the land, we are there only as a domesticated animal, as chattel property. Originally, the colonies of America were referred to as plantations. Plantations are tracts of land to raise crops and domesticated animals. As such, within that definition, we have no claim to the land as a Sestakv, a living beneficiary. The federal zone of the United States is also known as the domestic zone. Thus, it is where the domesticated animals are corralled as stock animals with brands seared into their flesh. This is why all esoteric logos or corporate brands are seared into our cellular structure by the constant barrage of electronic repetition. In other words, a human being is seen in the eyes of the law to be a domesticated animal whose signature is only a mark and hence is attached to an insurance or Social Security number to create commercial bondage, thus the mark of the beast. There again is another game played upon us, thinking that the mark of the beast is some number in a computer, when we are considered the beasts by their legal definitions, and the power of signature is our mark. By our own acts in one sense and lack of action in another, we have become the creators of our own prison to which we voluntarily assent by signature and seal. Those considered animals are no more than chattel, which is movable property, not real property. Real property is of the land and is derived from royal, as in the royal estate. Thus we are no more than cattle, landless serfs, those who comprise the civil body, the civitas, lifted off the land without substance or standing or capacity, because we are little more than domesticated animals. In the eyes of the owners, the royals and the elite, we are the monsters, and they just love to tell us all about it, hidden in plain sight. A logo M with its all-seeing eye, cute little monsters all wrapped up into a nice corporation. And then there's the website monster.com, where more monsters go to find work than any other site. Of course, all cattle are branded, and thus, as we stare mindlessly into the electronic beam tube called TV, we are continually branded in the mind by their corporate logos. The Sestake V Act of 1666. Men first went to war on land during the Crusades, and later went to sea during the Age of Exploration and Conquest. These men were landed and of the peerage through an oath of fealty, which is a bonded oath of loyalty to the crown and the monarch. They received a royal grant from the crown estate, or grant of land made patent by letters patent. This is the real definition of real estate. It is the land conveyed by royal grant from the line of the king and crown. Such men were known as sestakaves, defined as the life by which the duration of the estate is measured. Every sestakave had a male lineal descendant as the heir apparent, within what is known as the institution of heirs. These are not human beings, but men with inheritable blood. This is why bloodlines and genetic codes are considered paramount in the ownership of the land and this earth. As to where these bloodlines originated, that is another large topic for another time. Suffice it to say, those in the church and state and the landed gentry know from whence they have come and take every opportunity to honor and display it. With this status as sestake, the men had standing on the land and embodied the law. They had equitable interests and beneficial rights. To maintain their landhold, there was a reciprocal relationship with the sovereign who held the crown, the king or queen, through an oath of fealty and an oath of loyalty. This is why children are made to repeat an oath of allegiance to the flag. The United States flag was originally the flag of the British East India Company, the original joint stock corporation from the city. When we pledge allegiance, we are swearing an oath of fealty to the flag and its owner, the Lord Mayor of the City of London. This is our liege lord. The etymological root of the words allegiance, liege, legal, legislature, and legislation is all the same. Thus, when we bind ourselves as vassals through an oath of allegiance to the flag of the liege lord, we are binding ourselves to the corporate state and its legislative body as another variation of the law of the priest, as the corporate extension of the Crown Corporation of the City of London, to pass its codes and statutes and bind us to them pursuant to our oaths of fealty to their flag. Returning to the context of when such men would go to war and not return, those estates could not be settled because there was no proof of the cessation of that living man or sestake. When the age of global exploration and conquest began in 1492, there were men going to sea and not returning. Without proof of death, the estates could not be settled or passed on to the next sestake. So in 1666, the Sestake Act was passed. The act begins with the introduction, quote, "An act for redress of inconveniences by want of proof of the deceases of persons beyond the seas or absenting themselves, upon whose lives estates do depend." End quote. Thus, estates depend on the passage of beneficial rights to the next living beneficiary in line on the proof of death of the current sestake. To not be able to establish the fact of death was an inconvenience for which redress was required. The Sestake V belongs to the crown by oath of fealty, hence the royal we as the life of the royal estate. The crown presumes control and ownership for the pledged lives. Since the lives upon which estates depend are part of the life of the royal estate as the royal we, the reference to Sestake V's means the noble lives that are held by those oaths of fealty in feudal relationship to the crown as the ultimate liege lord. The crown is the lord, and even though they are of the aristocracy and noble birth, those men of the land are vassals to the higher lord. This is why the titular head of the City of London is called the Lord Mayor. So such Sestake V's, when lost at sea and presumed dead, must in one way or another have their estates settled so that the ancestral lineage of the estates can be properly maintained and moved forward as part of the all-encompassing global estate. Ultimately, it is all one hierarchical pyramid with the Holy See as the all-seeing eye at the top that will control everything based on the presumption of absolute authority vested into the Triple Crown as seen on the mitre worn by the Pope with its 3 crowns. But it is an authority based on one thing, the consent of the governed. When we withdraw that consent in sufficient numbers, it will be nothing more than sea foam dissipated on a windy day. We are both the observer and the observed, and when we do not observe this abomination of creation in its attempted usurpation, then it will cease to exist, as we are also the Creator and the created. The fulfillment of the Unam Sanctum was perfected over 700 years following the pronouncement by papal bull to present time. The 2 pillars were ultimately merged together into the one unified field of the head of the universal church that would own, control, and bind it all. Much like the phrase from the Tolkien story of Middle-earth, one ring of power to bind them all. The English word law is derived from an original word lal, wherein the 2 L's represent the 2 pillars that shall bind, hold, and contain all flesh and souls of the world. The letter A in the middle represents the alpha, which is also the pentagram, the feminine principle directly reflected in the orbit of the planet Venus, which over an 8-year period inscribes a perfect pentagram, as there is an almost perfect 5x8 mathematical formula in Venus's orbit. This is why the number 40 is the primary number used in the Bible, as it is the product of 5 times 8. The modern letter A is simply a pentagram where the crossbar is shortened, but if extended, creates the center cross of the pentagram, and from those extended points cross over and connect to the 2 anchor points at the bottom. So, contained within the 2 pillars is the symbolic representation of the feminine principle, the alpha, the beginning of all life, the prima mater of the physical substance of earth, whence all life emerges, contained and controlled by the king and the priest, as we have been demonstrating in this discussion. Similarly, the 2 pillars on the Social Security card contain the wet ink signature of the indentured slave when he or she places his or her consenting signature into the center between the pillar and beneath the mantle of Yahweh, the yoke of the world of bondage and toil. Hence, binding life between the 2 pillars established by the control of the land, the law, and the bondage of the sacred feminine principle of fecundity and sanctity of life. The 2 pillars are always the essential component. If we look at the solar orbit, the passage of the Earth around the Sun in one solar year, we can imagine the 2 pillars being placed on 2 specific points in that orbital path on the days we refer to as May 1st and November 1st, which are exactly opposite each other on the solar orbit of each year. These days of celebration and ritual are there in order to harvest the flesh and souls of the domesticated chattel property, the capita by which the monetary system is calculated, the cattle as those human beings lifted off the land and without inheritable blood. The first pillar on the circle of the solar orbit is May 1st, celebrated by the children's game of the Maypole. This is variously known as May Day, Workers' Day, and All Communists' Day, but was originally known as the Day of the Beltane King. A man was chosen from the society to be the king for a year, at the end of which he was ritually sacrificed in order to provide fertility to the land, and was resurrected as the Maypole, as the artificial phallus of Osiris resurrected as the obelisk. Whether Maypole or obelisk, this is the symbol around which the cattle gather for the harvesting of the flesh. Children dance around the Maypole, a phallic symbol of the progenitor capacity of the masculine principle, twirling ribbons of DNA double helices to bind the crystalline encoded essence of life in the physical itself. This is the artificial phallus of Osiris resurrected as the obelisk, brother, twin, husband of Isis, who, upon his death and dismemberment by his dark twin Set, is scattered along the Nile. When resurrected by Isis, she cannot find the phallus, so an artificial one, or obelisk, is raised in its stead. Thus we find the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, Washington, D.C., Paris, London, and all the other power centers of the world. In this resurrected state, Osiris becomes the god of the underworld, the god of death. Of course, in the modern iteration, Isis and Osiris are represented by their first initials, I and O, which become the 2 digits of the binary code of the AI global matrix computerized system, the artificial binding of the feminine and masculine principles into an eternal dance of polarity without union or resolution. They are also part of the quadratic pantheon with their brother and sister Set and Nephthys, their dark counterparts, with their 4 initials creating S-I-O-N, from which we have variations as the Sun, Sion, Zion, and Skyon. 6 months later in the annual or annual solar orbit, those who have left the flesh through physical death during the solar orbit have abandoned their ancestral lineal estates, the physically embodied genetic code and the material value and wealth they have created during their lifetimes. They are then gathered up by the Holy See to harvest, per the tenets of claiming all land, flesh, and souls, on the other pillar of solar time, November 1st, All Souls' Day, known as the Day of the Dead. This celebration is intended to harvest the equity and the abundance of the physical domain, the living substance of who we in fact really are, by the gathering and claiming, by maritime rules of salvage and claim, of the abandoned estates. The flesh is gathered around the Maypole, the representation of the dismembered phallus of Osiris, who is raised up as the Beltane King, which was once a sacred celebration of fertility and the unity of the feminine and masculine, but was later co-opted to be overlaid with this Isis-Osiris mystery cult symbolism.